When people tell me PTSD is an invisible wound, my answer is it's visible if you have the right scanner. Functional MRI, PET scan, things like that. You can actually see that. If people really change their mind, start to think about mental conditions as real physiological change in the brain, which is all mental condition has to come from the brain, and you can do something biologic about it, that's a huge thing right there. And I think people then will not accept 5% success rates over 20 years of therapy.
Are you curious about discovering ways of making your life better? Then welcome to my podcast. I'm Bob Nickman, and this is The Exploding Human. Listen in while I talk with all kinds of people in the fields of personal growth, health and healing, alternative therapies, psychology, spirituality, environment, and the future. I'm looking for those answers that make life better for everyone. You'll meet cutting-edge practitioners, doctors, artists, filmmakers, business people, and those who have overcome challenges. The brave, the curious, anyone who is out there helping us humans to explore, expand, and explode. Welcome to the show, guys. I'm so happy you're both here, and I'm really excited to talk about this topic because the topic of trauma comes up constantly in this podcast. There's two things that come up: gut inflammation and trauma as the source of so many problems. And the fact that you guys have written this great book about it, and we're going to talk about that some more. And I know that Jamie started with you, Eugene, as a patient. So can you guys just say how you met and what transpired, and then how you got together to write this book? This is just absolutely kind of blows my mind that two, from sort of disparate places have come together, mixing science, medicine, art, and all these things together. It's exactly like Eugene was saying. It's kind of what my show is about. We're exploding into this whole other realm by melding these things together. So Jamie, why don't you just say how you met Eugene?
He's good at that.
I was curious. I was really curious what Eugene was going to say.
Oh,
all right.
I've got a.
How would you describe how we met?
Oh, okay. I can do that because how about this?
Okay.
We'll give you a two answer. So so I've been doing the procedure for quite a while at that point. So we had a mutual acquaintance who was a pretty high level psychologist in the military. And the way she found me, because she was taking care of people who were suicidal. So it's a division of the Marines she was taking care of had the highest suicide rate. So that's how she and I met. She basically just called me out of the blue. She said, I've read all your papers. How about if I send you some patients and I want to come and see what you do? Poof. So we had some really good results. And then she called me up one day and she said, I know I have this very close friend, Jamie, who helped me design my book. Please take care of him. So you should send them to me. And he and I clicked pretty good. And when he came out of the procedure, he and I started talking, and I said, let's just go out to dinner and start chatting, and the rest is history. And I'll let Jamie finish the rest of it.
Well, in almost over 16, 17, 20 years of doing this, you've been doing it since 87, but really with PTSD since 2006, right? How many times have you invited a patient out to dinner?
Once.
So it was a unique experience, but yeah, I'm somebody that I'm an author and an art director and an artist, and that had to overcome a lot. I grew up in LA, your neck of the woods, but I grew up, I started off near MacArthur Park. So I pretty much grew up in slums, mostly in Mexican neighborhoods. Really, really extreme poverty, a lot of parental abandonment, literacy issues, everything you can imagine. And I found myself in my late teens, having to overcome literacy and all this trauma of just being abandoned by my parents and growing up in a violent environment, to being at a very prestigious university in England. So I went from one extreme to the other very quickly. And what drove me to do that, because people say, how did you do that? How did you overcome? And I was really driven by, I wanted to get away from ignorance. So I was driven towards education, and I was driven towards affluence and away from poverty. I thought affluence and ignorance would mean, affluence and education would mean no pain. And I got to university, this was over 25 years ago, and these guys had just as much problems as the people in the neighborhoods where I grew up, maybe more, but they didn't have a real thing in front of them, but they were traumatized. And it deflated me, because it wasn't the solution that I was looking for. It didn't solve this problem. And it really wasn't until all those years later, when I ended up in the middle of COVID, braving COVID, and I ended up on Dr. Lipov's table to get a reset of my nervous system, that I went, okay, this is what I was looking for. And the more successful I got over the last 6, 7 years, I thought success would calm me down, make me feel more comfortable in my body. And then I started to achieve success, the kind of success I wanted 7 or 8 years ago, and I was only more uncomfortable. Okay. So so then I started looking for solutions, and I came and I can, through Lemony Snicket's series of fortunate events, I came across Dr. Lipov, and I did something I never do. When you grow up poor, you don't go to the doctor. You just don't seek medical care. So these are things that I would never do, right? So not only did I go to a doctor in the middle of COVID, where there was 8 people on the plane, but I did it, went for an experiment, not experimental, but a new procedure. The military, it's pretty normal. That because I was really, really desperate to feel good about my accomplishments.
Wow, what a story. Did you feel like when you got this success, did you feel like an imposter?
I didn't have imposter syndrome.
Okay.
I felt like I deserved to be there because it took me so long. I had more just always thinking something bad was going to happen, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Anxiety, mild paranoia. Okay. I was ridiculously hyper vigilant. I was hyper aroused. It was just constantly feeling like I was under threat when good things were happening. That was really the best way to describe it. And that's really what Dr. Lipov's innovation, which I think he'll win the Nobel Prize. And I think it's the most important medical innovation since the discovery of penicillin in 1928. I think it dwarfs the polio vaccine in terms of its implications to save lives. And I think it's probably the most important human innovation since the moon landing. These are the kind of things that I say. And I think if you read our book, The Invisible Machine, who's got a lot of amazing data behind it and a lot of really, really respected scientists, I don't think too many people could disagree with me.
It's interesting that we're going to talk to Eugene here in a second. The idea of, I used to say this about my teenage son when he was off the rails with the nonsense he was up to. I said, I just wish I could crawl inside there and rewire him, but that's impossible. Now you're telling me in a sense, that's kind of what you're doing. And so tell me how you came to do this. I know you were in pain management is where you started, I think. And I'm guessing you're an anesthesiologist by training. So why don't you tell me what transpired to take you to and talk about the procedure and all the things, sympathetic nervous system, all the things that we need to know about, because this is unbelievable.
Wow. Appreciate kind words. Well, in order to understand what happened and why it happened, let me go back to my father. So my father was a chest surgeon. My mother was an endocrinologist. So my father was in World War II, and in his squadron of 10,000, 100 people made it home. He was one of the 100. So he had severe PTSD, and he shared that. It's called secondary PTSD medically. So he gave it to me and my mother and my brother. So, and you'll see why it's relevant. So then I went to medical school. So everybody in my family are doctors, like my father, my mother, my brother. So I went to medical school. I did pretty well. I went to Northwestern. I wanted to be a surgeon like my father. And then 3 months into my surgical residence, my mother killed herself. So it was extremely traumatizing, to put it mildly. And then she was under care of psychiatrist. And then I was pretty distraught because my father was very depressed. And again, it was quite ugly. So I lasted another year in surgery. I left surgery and I went into anesthesia. Didn't really like anesthesia particularly much, but I did all the complex stuff, anesthesia in academic environment. Then I got into pain medicine, which is I like that part of it because it's related to kind of procedures and things like that. Anyway, so then we had a patient that had severe hot flashes. I had a patient. I sent to my brother, who is a really smart internist, and I said, I don't do hot flashes. You take care of her. So he tried to take care of her with all the hormones, whatever. Nothing worked. So he said, you do this procedure called stellate ganglion block, which is an injection in the neck to numb up the nerves, or CRPS, which is burning of the hand. He said, burning hand, burning everything is the same thing. I'm like, it's not. He said, just go ahead and try it. So we tried it. It worked really well. And then I published on that. And then Chicago Tribune came by, and they were pretty aggressively negative about what I was doing, even though I had publications. And they said, yes, it's working, but you do not know how it works. So that's a horrible thing to do. You're a bad doctor. They call me needle plungers. Jamie likes to call me, which is pretty ugly. Anyway, so they gave me a lot of encouragement to try to understand it. So I read about 3,000 articles, anything and everything related to sympathetic system, which is fight and flight system, which stellate is part of. And I was just trying to understand why it worked for hot flashes. So I came across an article from Finland where they did T2 clipping, which is basically you put trocars in the chest, push the lungs out of the way, and you put a little clip which turns off fight and flight system in the chest for hand sweats. And then they found at the same time PTSD went away. I was like, what is that? That makes no sense. I've been doing stellate forever. The first time I personally did stellate ganglion block was 1987. First time it was ever done by anesthesiologists in France was 1926. So I read about it, and I called up my brother and I said, hey, if you have a patient who has PTSD, I think we can help them. So he sent me a patient that was robbed at gunpoint. 2 months after the robbery, he was on his way to be admitted to psychiatric ward. So he comes to my office, we do the procedure, PTSD went away, and he didn't have to be admitted. So that led to the first publication, 2008. So as I looked into it in more detail, turns out there is direct connection from sympathetic fibers here to the brain. And that's how we can modulate the brain by an injection here, because that's one of the common questions people ask me. Why would the shot in the neck do anything to the brain? That makes no sense. You're not sticking a needle in the head.
What's amazing to me is that there's a psychological what appears to be a psychological problem, but now you're saying it's not really. It's a problem that manifests physically based on an event.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Okay, let me just finish. Let me give you an answer to Kevin, if you don't mind. So that's the whole thing. So one of the big takeaways from the book is we want to change the name, a perspective of the name, PTSD to PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury. So Jamie can give you some of the background where PTSI term came from. In fact, we just set up a PSA, high quality PSA, public service announcement about that specific thing. It is very important to think of PTSD, so-called, as a biological phenomena that is, it's possible to see. When people tell me PTSD is an invisible wound, my answer is it's visible if you have the right scanner. Functional MRI, PET scan, things like that. You can actually see that. If people really change their mind, start to think about mental conditions as real physiological change in the brain, which is all mental condition has to come from the brain, and you can do something biologic about it, that's a huge thing right there. And I think people then will not accept 5% success rates over 20 years of therapy.
I was just going to say one thing before this, because I just watched this last night. There's a doctor named Mark Hyman, who's a functional medicine doctor, and he was interviewing another doctor similar, and they were saying almost the exact same thing about ADHD, that it is not a psychological disorder, and that it can be treated in many ways with other things that are biological.
I'm sure that with the stellate ganglion block, which has been around for almost 100 years, is Dr. Lipov has innovated into what's called the DSR, the dual sympathetic reset. It's a reboot of the nervous system. And he can talk maybe in a minute about how that reset can affect ADHD. I don't know if he's done it on ADHD patients. Have you, Doc? Sure. Okay. But you know, quickly, what I'd like to talk about is this term PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury. One of the things Dr. Lipov often talks about is we would never tell someone to, like, when someone acts crazy, we're like, snap out of it, get it together, right?
Walk it off.
But yeah, walk it off. But if someone has a broken leg, this is Dr. Lipov, you know, you would never ask anyone to snap out of a broken leg. So what's really important here is when someone has a trauma is 100% predominantly, okay, a biological injury to the body. Okay, the reason, and that makes sense. If we all had different reactions, if it was this ambiguous, amorphous mental thing, and we all had different reactions to trauma, we wouldn't survive. We're a survival species. We need to have a consistent way of either fighting or flighting to survive as a species. We need to run from tigers or we need to defeat tigers. And so this point of, and the term disorder, which is a lie, is incredibly stigmatizing. What if you told somebody they had a broken leg and you're like, listen, man, you got that broken leg, you're crazy, right? It's incredibly stigmatizing. So you got to go back to, there's a very famous psychiatrist that is a close friend of Eugene's, and he's become a friend of mine through Eugene. He's an old man. He's probably 85 years old, but he's very famous. And in 1970, he came out with a book with a bunch of Stanford doctors, Stanford scientists, called Violence and a Struggle for Existence. And that book, the foreword was done by came out on Little Brown. The foreword was done by Coretta Scott King, because it was 2 years after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And there's a chapter in there called Biology and Aggression. And these doctors, Ochberg included, are basically saying, we know trauma is biological. And the reason we know is if you take a goat, a dog, a cat, you take any animal and you abuse it and you terrorize it, it's going to change. And it's going to act one of two ways. It's going to be very, very timid, or it's going to be very, very aggressive. It's not sentient. They don't have a disorder, right? So they know they're changing that animal biologically. And I don't think it was until Dr. Ochberg came across Eugene's work that he realized that he found this mechanism. It's now 50 years later, and anyone in the world can get this. There's a place called Stella Center that is opening up clinics with Dr. Lipov's innovations, which are the most modern, efficacious innovations in the world, 85 to 90% effective in the relief of trauma. So you flash forward from 1970, that book, right? So we know, but he knew trauma was biological back in 1970, okay? And they knew before that, but that's a book I like to reference. You flash forward to 2012, and Dr. Ochberg is trying to get the term PTSD changed to PTSI. And then they got together and have been working together. So Frank Ochberg is very famous because he defined Stockholm Syndrome for the FBI in the 1970s. So he's a world famous psychiatrist. So so it is a physical injury to the body. When someone experiences an extreme trauma, the amygdala sends a signal to this ganglion of nerves in your neck, the stellate ganglion, also known as the sympathetic nervous system. And typically, if we almost hit something with our car, we almost slip and fall, we get heightened. The amygdala sends the signal to our neck. Those nerves in our neck jerk us into action, and we either run or we fight. Okay. Well, typically 5 hours later, 3 hours later, we return back to baseline. But if that trauma is too great, and there's two things that make that trauma too great, it's an overwhelming trauma, like seeing your buddy killed in front of you in war or a sexual assault. If you get too heightened, the sympathetic nervous system stays stuck up in fight or flight 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, 7 days a week. Okay, it gets stuck up. So you feel like you're going to die all the time when you're doing nothing, right? And the other thing that causes it to get stuck up is what's called prolonged allostatic load, chronic stress over time. I think that's the main culprit in American society and Western society. I would argue that 50% of the US and global population have an overactive sympathetic nervous system. They don't associate themselves with trauma. Dr. Lipov has been doing this ridiculously successful for almost 20 years. The military is probably doing 15 to 20,000 of these a year. Fort Bragg is doing 3,000 a year alone. You see first responders getting it and talking about it on Rogan. It's been on 60 Minutes, CBS This Morning. But it's always associated with the extreme. What Dr. Lipov and I are trying to do with this book, with me as an artist and him as a scientist, is to bring this to the masses. A plumber, a housewife, a yoga instructor, a CEO, an attorney that doesn't even associate themselves with trauma. You can get this from having distant parents, from being bullied. So you have all these people that are uncomfortable in their bodies, but I don't have trauma. That's for people that went through something. And so we're trying to bring this away from the extreme, help the people at the extreme, but bring it away from there. And this should be as popular as Botox and LASIK. It can change the way that you move through the world.
If I may add one more thing to it, I think we have the purpose of the book. There are a number of things in it. Number one, I think if you start to think about PTSI versus PTSD, just the mere fact, if people can change their minds, I think that'd be extremely helpful. But then once you do think that, it's like, okay, so if you're using analogy of the broken leg, where's the cast? You can't put a cast in your head. And my point is they have to be doing something. It is an action associated with it.
I was asked by my publisher, if there was one thing you could accomplish with this book, what would it be? And I said, well, really, it's two things. And they were like, what is it? One is that I could bring it to the masses. So if there was no Stella Center, if Eugene hadn't teamed up with his private equity firm 3.5 years ago, they have 35 clinics across the United States where you can get it with his modifications. I mean, it went from 7 years ago, it went from 70% effective to 85 to 90%. So if you're not getting it from the Stella Center with the Stella protocols, you're not getting it. They were even doing it wrong at Fort Bragg when I went there for the first time 2 years ago. But one point that Eugene made, the second thing that I care about is what the point that Eugene just made is, if people could walk away from this book and they know in their heart that trauma is a biological injury, which it is, if all we accomplish is that, we could change the world.
Yeah, well, you just opened my mind to something that I hadn't really thought about it that way. You hear PTSD constantly. Now, when you were talking, I have two situations. Well, one situation was a number of years ago. I hit somebody with my car. Person didn't die or anything, but it was traumatic. And for me, I'm sure it was traumatic for him too, but probably more so. But yeah, I mean, don't feel sorry for me, but I literally, I didn't want to get in my car. I didn't want to drive. When I would walk down the street, I was paranoid that I was going to get hit by a car. I was having reliving the visions of seeing the guy up on my hood. I felt awful. I was really and over time it did dissipate, and I don't really have that now, but it was so, there's probably still a little bit of residual from that. Now, I also have people in my life that were raised in homes that were abusive in some way, and they seem to have an ongoing issue with, like what you were talking about, Jamie, about just being anxious and thinking, when things are not good. I'm thinking of one person in particular. She says, "Oh, I just don't want to be here anymore. It's too hard. Life is just too hard." And not many things are even going on. It's just this.
I'd like to comment on that, Bob.
Okay.
If you have to, one of the things that Eugene, Dr. Lipov, talks about, there's a guy that, Peter Levine's work. I mean, he started this analogy, I guess, I don't know when he was writing those books, the 80s, did he start using this analogy? Of running from the tiger. You have to look at the fight or flight system. What's happening here is the fight or flight system is getting stuck on. What Eugene's procedure does, which doesn't go near the brain, but it affects the brain. You could scan the brain with an fMRI. You see overactivity in the amygdala, maybe some decreased blood flow to the frontal cortex. You do this procedure over 2 days, 1 or 2 days, and then you could scan the brain again less than 24 hours later, and you'd see changes in blood flow to the frontal cortex, and you'd see the amygdala activity calm down. But we're not going near the brain. So the signal is in the neck is lying to the brain. Eugene can explain the science behind that. But back to your friend and this concept of, you have to look at this from what would happen. How would you feel if you were running from a tiger? And I'm going to speak to your friend very specifically. Okay. If you were running from a tiger, you would have 7 or 8 symptoms that would keep you alive. Okay. You would be anxious. You would need anxiety to be looking out for the tiger. You would have mild paranoia. You would need mild paranoia to either defeat the tiger or run from the tiger. You would have a sense of doom that would keep you alert. The tiger could be anywhere. You would be hypervigilant about the tiger. You would be hyper aroused in an aroused state. You wouldn't be able to sleep if there was a tiger chasing you. Most of these guys coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan, or a huge percentage of them, have erectile dysfunction because you can't have sex if you're running from a tiger. You have a hair trigger, you're reactive if a tiger's in the woods. Ultimate flight, the ultimate feeling of flight in the world, in the military where people are trained to protect, is suicide, the ultimate flight. In the neighborhoods where I grew up in LA, where violence is more acceptable, ultimate fight is homicide, right? So when you're looking at your friend in particular, you have to imagine that someone's locked in a state where they think, where their body is telling them at any second, and it's a spectrum. Some people have it worse than others, but their body's locked in a state where these nerves in their neck is telling their brain that they're about to die, but they're on their couch watching Netflix, drinking a Pabst Blue Ribbon, or eating Doritos. Okay, So think about that for a second, Bob. Think about if this is how I felt, but I didn't know it. Okay. And you can exacerbate these feelings with substances. Okay. That affect, that exacerbate these things by creating toxicity in the brain. It can exacerbate the symptoms of an overactive sympathetic. But think about if you felt like those 7 or 8 symptoms that I just named all the time. You felt hair trigger, lack of sleep. You felt like you were going to die on some level all the time. Well, listen, you wouldn't want to live, or you'd want to kill somebody.
Yeah, I call it cornered animal is what it seems like to me when it's activated. When I've seen it, there's a look in the eye that's just very terrified.
Eugene, why don't you tell him why we call the book The Invisible Machine? Yeah.
Fair enough. So invisible machine means invisible machine is the sympathetic system. Most people don't do dissections, right? So, but most people don't think about it. But it's interesting. So there are 2 things I want to comment on. So one, people talk about wild-eyed maniacs, right? You've heard that term before.
Sure.
So the pupils are opened up like this.
Mm-hmm.
They're hyperventilating and they're sweating, right? That's all sympathetic system. Sympathetic system makes you sweat, opens up your eyes like this, all of that. That's all part of fight and flight. Interesting, everybody brings up dogs. I was actually the first one in the world to treat a dog who had PTSD. He ran away from his owner, got stuck under a truck and got burned. So he was a sweet service animal. After that, he was not very sweet. He tried to attack people, tried to eat the cages, stuff like that. So we did a block on him and it really worked. I can send you the article that was written about it. It's kind of interesting. And I can send you pictures. But the point is the physiologic similarities between animals and humans. We are a fence animal, but the limbic system in a mammalian system like dogs and humans is very similar. The difference between us and the dogs, our prefrontal cortex is bigger, so we can think. But sympathetic system is all pervasive. It's always watching to help you. And to me, if you look at, I'd like to kind of make it a little more sciencey, as Jamie would say. So the main transmitter in the body from sympathetic system is called norepinephrine. So if you take the fluid around the brain, it's called CSF in the human that has PTSD, it's going to be twice as high as somebody who doesn't. So we know that it exists. If you put in too much norepinephrine, sexual dysfunction occurs, many other things occur. Also, you were talking about before that leaky gut syndromes and things like that. There is a direct connection from the brain to the gut and back and forth. But what's interesting is there have been papers written that stellate ganglion block actually can fix ulcerative colitis, which is the problem inside the gut. So there is a direct connection from the neck to the gut. IBS, we've treated people who had IBS and things like that. So basically tightening of gut. So it's very interesting when you see something and you take a breath and it's like, oh my God, and your gut tightens up. That's all. Sympathetic system is saying it is not happy.
2 questions. Yeah, because one of these topics has never come up on here before, but with us before. One is I'd like you to define the difference between SGB and your innovation of DSR.
Sure.
And then I would also like, one thing I've never asked you about is can DSR treat ADHD?
All right, so we'll start with DSR first. So the original block that was done, basically block means just putting a local anesthetic, numbing up a nerve. That's all it means. So if you go to a dentist, they're numbing up a lingual nerve right here, and you don't feel the jaw. So it's kind of the same thing. Here, we're just isolating a very specific nerve bundle, which is great because you can get to it pretty easily. I use ultrasound to make sure it's safe. So again, the original stellate ganglion block was done in 1926. And then I was doing it and I had really good results. I had a gentleman that came in who I took care of his back pain. He was a retired sniper from the Marines. So he came in, he was pretty nearly suicidal, and he and his wife came in and I tried to put him in a hospital, regardless how it all went down. Anyway, so I took him to the operating room, did the injection, and it did not work. So I'm looking at him, he says, Doc, it didn't work. It's, thanks for trying, but I'm still going to complete my plan. I was very frightened, to put it mildly. And so before I got in PTSD ward, I was treating people with hot flashes. So I was in Norway. I was invited by the government of Norway to treat people there. So we came up with some other ideas how to do. It turns out there is another fight and flight bundle in the neck called superior cervical ganglion. So I learned how to do it there. So this guy, the sniper, I took him back to the operating room and I did second injection after the first one. Out of the operating room came out 5 minutes later. He said, "I feel great, doc. Thank you very much." So he was like that.
Wow.
So I was like, what is that? You know, the people who trained me were the best people in the world about those blocks. Nobody's ever thought about dual blocks. So I was trying to figure out why that did anything, because that made no sense. So I found the answer in the book that was published by James Moore called Stellate Ganglion Block, 1956, out of print in 72. And there's a beautiful diagram. Turns out fight and flight nerves come out of the chest, go to the neck at stellate ganglion. They go to the brain following one of the arteries called vertebral artery. But only 50% of the fibers. The other 50% go up higher, superior cervical ganglion, and they go up to a different part of the brain. So the bottom line is when we do a two-level injection, we seem to reset two different parts of the amygdala or the festival. And especially whenever people ask me that question, I always think of the sniper who survived just because of that. And that was a very frightening moment in my career, but thankfully he did great. As far as ADHD basically is one of the symptoms, and there is a whole discussion that can be had about diagnostic, how accurate it is. It seems to be 1/3 of the kids that can afford it have to be on ADHD meds because they're not active enough. Then I mean, who's making the diagnosis? I'm not getting into that, but a lot of times people are sleepy because they have difficulty with sleep, which could be one of the biggest signs of PTSD or PTSI. If they're sleepy and they're trying to sleep 2 hours a day, and now they need to take speed to function, that's not ADHD technically.
So that could be hypervigilance, that could be hyperarousal, right?
Right. Well, the point is it's a secondary effect from not sleeping enough.
Okay.
If you're always revved up, you never have a chance to have a rest. No wonder you're going to need something. If you look at what's the Ritalin, what is that? It's amphetamine. It revs you up. So it's like drinking tons of coffee, kind of chemical. And now, I'd be actually very curious to see what happens as there is a shortage of Ritalin. What actually happened to those people? Did they do better or worse? I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist.
Yeah, I guess we'll find out. I mean, the sort of thing that they say about it is that it has the opposite effect on people that are hyperactive. You give them the Ritalin and it calms them down. That always seemed odd to me, but I don't know why that they say that, but it just
I can give you an answer to that.
Okay.
The way people are trained in medical school is that if you have prefrontal cortex, if you activate that, then you can suppress other things. If you have a hypoactive prefrontal cortex. So if you can activate that, so if somebody doesn't have a hypoactive, then you give them adrenaline, then they start bouncing off the walls. And the people who don't can now control themselves. That's one of the explanations I've heard. I really don't know. I don't believe 1/3 of our society has a diagnosis. It's hard for me to believe that. Maybe, but I'm not an expert. Treated people who had PTSD. The problem is, to me, psychiatry is not one of those science that you can just do a scan. It's getting there, but it's not there. So if you look at DSM-5A, which is the latest assessment tool, when somebody comes in, they go home with diagnosed, let's say 6, 7 things. You have features of PTSD, you have features of depression, feature of anxiety, you have features of the ADHD, you have feature of this, feature of that. But if you have PTSD or your invisible machine is revved on, well, guess what? You're going to have PTSD or PTSI. If you have PTSD or PTSI, you're going to be depressed. You're going to be anxious, right? So how can you separate those? You can't.
Yeah, I mean, but think about it, Bob, and I would love to get your take on this is like the everyman, because I see you as kind of like the everyman, the way you have that vibe about you, in the Jimmy Stewart way. Okay. Um,
Wasn't
the,
always like this, Jamie.
but think about it like this. I just went through all those symptoms of anxiety, paranoia, sense of doom, hypervigilance, hyperarousal, reactivity, lack of sleep, and then in the extreme cases, violence and suicidal ideation. That's probably about 80 to 90% of the psychiatric ills that are plaguing the Western world. And if you look at Gabor Mate's work and what he talks about, when you see, he's completely transformed the way that I look at addiction. I was very judgmental towards addicts my whole life because I grew up with them, and I was like, well, I didn't do it. I figured it out. That's a lie. What Gabor says is that if you see somebody that's an addict, all they're trying to do is regulate their nervous system. They're self-medicating their nervous system.
Right.
They're not an addict. There's no such thing as an addict, really. It's a person trying to regulate their nervous system from trauma. It's a traumatized person, right?
100%, Jamie.
Yeah.
I always say alcoholics, as people call alcoholics, I say they taking their troubles for a drink.
Or swim. Yeah. Yeah. So
they have to come back.
Yeah. So with the science, as the more and more data comes in, right? We partnered with Daniel Amen on this book, and he's got, they're limited scans, but he's got almost 200,000 brain scans that show surface abrasion and blood flow in the brain. And so we were able to scan a lot of people using that and correlate Dr. Lipov's work with Dr. Amen's work. But if you think about it, those 7 symptoms that I just named are about 80 to 90% of the psychiatric ills in one form or another. So I believe that the sympathetic system is why we're medicating people, and we can reset it now. And you just feel you can reset. It's like rebooting a computer. He turns it off with the block by numbing the nerves. It comes back on 10 minutes later at baseline. And so you don't need to sit and even there's even positive things like yoga, running, breath work, nature, animals, all of these things regulate the sympathetic nervous system. We're also not, and bring it down. We're not designed, we're evolutionary species, right? So for 50,000 years, we lived in natural settings. Nature brings down the sympathetic system. Being around animals brings down the sympathetic system. But in an artificial environments where we live now, we live in an artificial box. We get into an artificial roving box to go to another artificial box to work. We work in that artificial box all day. And then you look at the emergence of what's occurring with digital media and the digital world and all that messaging. Our biology is not caught up to live in that system. It's stressful. It's creating a constant stress. Okay. So I believe that as the data comes in, and what we're seeing is that most of these symptoms are related to the sympathetic system. And, even you should do yoga because you like yoga, not because you have to do it every day to regulate the sympathetic system, right? So that's what we're talking about here. The scale of what we're talking about here and how it affects the world is staggering. And I've seen it, Dr. Lipov sees it every day. I've sent dozens and dozens of people from the U.S. military. Dr. Lipov and I have been working in special forces. I spent 10 of my white successful CEO friends in the last 2 years that never associated with trauma that I thought had this. And what we're seeing and what he sees every day, it's almost impossible to believe. So what are your thoughts on that, Bob?
Well, yes, there was a lot there, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I'm just talking about this idea that this change in biology could be responsible for this, medical and psychotropic industrial complex. It's really a profit center. I don't really like to talk too much about the pharmaceutical companies. I really just like to talk about the elite.
Oh, I have a lot of commentary on the pharmaceutical industry on this podcast.
Okay.
None of it is very good.
Okay. Yeah.
So let me say a couple of things. One, I am familiar with Dr. Amen, and I'm familiar with Gabor Mate, and it's pretty fascinating stuff. And we can talk more about those specific guys. I just on a personal level, I am sober for 37 years. I identify as an alcoholic. I don't use any drugs or alcohol anymore. But I have to say, I'm going to go back to the first time I got drunk, really, or stoned. It was a sense of ease and comfort and relief from being who I was that I chased for about 15 years. And so I don't have any big specific traumatic events, but whatever my mind was doing and telling me, and the way I observed life, and some of the things you talked about in terms of what society does to people, and obviously family of origin and all those things, that was absolutely a way to manage the way I felt and the way I was reacting. I was, as the 12 steps say, I was restless, irritable, and discontented. Those were all who I was. And when I first read that, I went, how do these people know who I am? That was the first thing I thought. People knew who I was. So I was anxious, agitated.
You're describing an overactive sympathetic nervous system, Bob.
Exactly.
If I may, I'd like to give you a thought, Bob. So I don't know anything about your family of origin, but one of the things, have you heard the term epigenetics? Epigenetic change?
Yes.
So I wrote a paper, which I can share with you if you like, which details specifically what happens when somebody has trauma, which part of the genome changes, and it activates part of the brain that actually makes the sympathetic nerves grow easier. So let's say your grandfather had some kind of a horrible event. That's still in your genes. So when people say there are trending in families of alcohol, I would say the invisible machine is way too active, and they're looking to have peace and contentment. Because when you have too much norepinephrine in the brain, you're not going to be happy. So that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, when I think about the history of just my own family and the trauma that was there, my grandparents had to flee Russia and come over on a boat at 17 years old and live through the Depression and, just the different things that life throws at people. And who knows what went on with my grandparents' parents and grandparents. I don't really know. I mean, we all come from Jewish heritage, which has an historical abuse, throughout history. So, it's hard to say, why some people manage those things better than other people, why I turned to, the shortcut. It was, it's a shortcut to regulate, and when it works, to me the brain went, oh, well, keep doing it, and then all of a sudden, I think maybe the body chemistry changes, and then you need it, and that's the scary part.
Yeah, you change the brain, and
it's all physiology. That's exactly it. It's not a weakness of the soul. You're not drinking because there is a change in the brain, and I think it really appalls me when people say, well, we need to treat addiction like a disease. No, we need to treat addiction as a symptom of underlying condition, and it's much easier to fix.
Yeah,
it's not a disease; it's a symptom.
It makes me think of my first conversation with Daniel Amen, and then the subsequent interview that I did with him. And in my first conversation with Daniel Amen, there was a psychiatrist named Dr. John Faber, who's probably the most bona fide forensic psychiatrist in the United States, if not in the world. And he'd written a book called Escape, Rehabilitate Your Brain, Stay Out of the Legal System and Rehabilitate Your Brain. And Daniel's work is all about how brain toxicity and TBI is the main culprit behind a lot of the mental, conditions we see. But again, he was taking a biological approach and has for 30 years. And he was, ridiculed for that, even though it made him maybe the most famous psychiatrist in the United States, Daniel. As the data science has come in, he's been proven right and continues to be proven right. So Dr. Jay Faber and he was a fan of my previous book, and he and I became friends, and he kind of forced Daniel Amen and I onto a first phone call. I don't think Daniel Amen wanted to be there. That's my theory. And so I was just asking questions and trying to understand. And, and I felt like he could get up and walk out of that first conversation at any moment. I mean, I feel like now we're very friendly. But at one point, at some point, I said, Daniel, how come you were a quack? How come people labeled you a quack for so many years? And he mentioned a quote from a Nobel laureate from the 1940s in physics, a guy named Max Planck, who said that medical innovation is won in funerals. You have to wait for your opposition to die. But I finally said to Daniel on that call, I said, Daniel, I've seen what I've seen. I've done it for myself. The military is doing this much. You did your residency, I think, at Walter Reed, right? All I'm asking you to do is look. I need you to tell me this is not true. If you tell me it's not true, it's gonna mean something to me. I'm just asking you to look, because if it's true, and this is a major part of the mechanism that you've been doing for 30 years, you should be a part of it. And he just looked at me and he said, hold on. We're on a Zoom call. He starts Googling around in front of me, and his kind of mouth falls open. He's like, huh. And I go, what? He says, there's an incredible, a very credible study here that says that this thing is 70% effective in the permanent and the most extreme symptoms of post-traumatic stress. I said, Daniel, that's got to be at least a 10-year-old paper. This, with the recent innovations and modifications of Dr. Lipov, it's now up to 85 to 90%. Daniel Amen looks at me through the Zoom call and says, Jamie, at 70%, this is Nobel Prize winning work. I'll help you.
Oh, what?
Okay.
You
and then
did it, Jamie.
Yeah, well, Gene did it. Gene did it really. Okay. And then in a subsequent interview at his office in Orange County, I asked him, I said, in your opinion, what percentage of people that are on psychotropics today just have a biological issue that could be remediated with maybe with DSR, supplements, hyperbaric, all the ketamine, and not be dependent for the rest of their lives? He said 80%. What people have to understand that are listening to this, right.
Whoa.
People have to, exactly. I kept using the word mental illness on that call, and he looked sour when I would say the word. I said, what's wrong? He said, please don't use that word. Why? I said, mental illness? Yeah, don't use that word. I was like, what's wrong with it? He goes, it's stigmatizing and it's not true. I said, well, what do you want me to use? He said, brain health issues. And I said, okay, I'll use brain health issues, right? So what people need to understand, it's, I think, a primary takeaway from this conversation, which has been an amazing conversation, is that DSR is the fundamental broken leg of this system, okay? And when there's all these amazing modalities out there, dual sympathetic reset, there's all these amazing modalities out there. There's EMDR, talk therapy, ketamine. They're getting incredible effects from psilocybin. I'm not a big fan of cannabis because THC ravages the brain. We know this, right? I'm a fan of things that we know don't do damage to the body or don't create a problem to solve a problem. But there's all these incredible modalities out there. The way you have to look at this is the amount of progress one can get in 1 to 2 days with Dr. Lipov or at Stella Center. And if you're not going to Stella Center, you're not getting this. He's got the most efficacious protocols in the world. The amount of gain that you can get in 1 or 2 days will transform your life so that the other therapies work and work better. It's kind of like if you're doing those therapies without first resetting your nervous system, you're doing physical therapy over a broken leg. You wouldn't do that in the world. You would reset the broken leg, wait for it to heal, then you would go to the physical therapist. And we hear reports over and over and over again that all these incredible modalities in the world become exponentially more effective if you reset the leg first. It also gives the person hope, because it may take 3 months, 6 months, 9 months to get progress with these other things. You can feel better after 1 or 2 days of the safe, simple outpatient procedure of Dr. Lipov than you could with years of other things. And then that gives you the energy and the strength to become fully yourself. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. Is we're talking about a broken leg you can't see that's fundamental. And then there's people listening to this that are saying, well, God, I have those symptoms and I've never been traumatized. Listen, Dr. Lipov can comment on this. Some people are more sensitive than others. You can get this from a mother that needles you when you're 8. If you right now, you are listening to this, and you think you might have some of those symptoms, you likely have an overactive sympathetic nervous system. The book is The Invisible Machine. You can borrow it from the library.
Jamie, I'm going to run. Again, there are 2 messages. PTSD should be gone, should be turned PTSI, and there is a treatment for that. And the last thing I'll leave you with, there is hope. The reason my mother killed herself, she had no hope. And this kind of stuff can give people hope.
Hope is the thing. Thank you so much for being on the show. Jamie, can you stay a couple minutes?
Yeah, I'll stay. I'm good.
Okay.
Thanks,
guys. All right. So,
all right,
Eugene, thank you so much. Okay. Wow. What an interesting man. And so are you, by the way.
Thank you.
I was going to ask him before he left, but I guess you could probably speak to it. What does the actual procedure look like? And what is what blocks and how long does it last?
It's a great question. Okay. So most cases, it can last years, and in many cases, it can last permanently. Obviously, if you re-traumatize yourself, you would need to get another reset.
Okay.
Right? What's happening, what he's doing is he's taking the same $2 amount of anesthesia that goes into an epidural. So it's never going to be a big, a massive, huge winner for the pharmaceutical companies because people don't need to be dependent on something for the rest of their life when they do this. And what he does is he basically uses an ultrasound. We know it's safe because it's been around for 100 years. He uses an ultrasound to find the stellate ganglion bundle of nerves at the C6 and the C3 vertebra. That's why we call it the dual sympathetic reset, because it's a dual injection on the right side of the neck. Adult trauma, what we found is adult trauma manifests itself on the right side of the neck. Any trauma before puberty, childhood trauma, is the left side. So they're starting to do more and more right, left side. We used to be, they would just give people the right side. Then 5, 6, 7 years ago, a brilliant doctor, an ex-Navy SEAL doctor in Annapolis, Maryland, named Sean Mulvaney, did it on the left side when someone didn't get better that had childhood trauma, and they were better. So now it's regular part of it's a normal part of the procedure. But they're basically using this dual injection at the C3 and the C6 vertebra. They're turning off those nerves with local anesthetic. They turn on 10 minutes later at baseline, pre-trauma state.
So it's like rebooting your computer almost.
It's the best analogy that you could give. That's why we call it the reset, the dual sympathetic reset. And, I had the guy that's the tentpole, we're also working on a film. The guy that's really the story of the film, the tentpole in the book, is a guy named Trevor Beeman. He's a fascinating guy. I was afraid of him when I met him. He was molested by his stepfather from 7 or 8 to 16. The guy went to jail. Then he became a special forces fighter. He was beaten. He's a white guy. He looks like a Calvin Klein model, but he was beaten to the Latin Kings at age 10 or 11. He shot at medical heroin in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's killed people. He's seen people killed. He's active duty special forces. I interviewed him, and he's got a wife and 2 beautiful children, and that's all that's kept him alive. The special force, they don't want crazy special forces people out there. They get extra resources. They've spent a gajillion dollars trying to fix this guy. Nothing made him better. It just made him be able to get through the day to live for his family. I interviewed him at Fort Bragg almost 2 years ago. And then 6 months later, so it's been about 18 months, he went and got the dual sympathetic reset in Chicago. And literally that guy went from, after 30 years homicidal toward his stepfather, 20 years suicidal, he went just back to being a person. And I see that Dr. Lipov sees that every single day. How I got wrapped up in this film is, I sent a guy that is the grandson of a billionaire, one of my white friends that probably did not associate with having trauma. But his father, I got convinced this guy to go. He was a business partner of mine. He didn't want to do it. He went through, got the right side done. It didn't do anything for him. He said, this isn't working, but I'll maybe do the left side tomorrow at dinner that night. I said, just do the left side. He goes and does the left side the next day. I'm with his wife, who's a close friend of mine. We're in the surgical center. It's February in Chicago. And I'm downstairs waiting, talking to his wife. The doctor comes down the stairs. And this is the last story because I really think this communicates what we're talking about. And I say, how's he doing? And the doctor said, he says he feels great. And his wife burst into tears. And I said, whoa, wait a second. We don't know if this worked. We don't know if this worked. And she says, Jamie, you don't understand. My husband has never said he's felt great since I've known him. And we're waiting for this guy. And now that the doctor, Dr. Lipov, and my friend are talking downstairs, and it was COVID, this very beautiful woman walks in. You could see her beamingly smiling under her mask. And she sees Dr. Lipov, and she runs up to him and she gives him a long hug that lasts probably 30 seconds. And she turns to my friend and I, and she says, the miracle man, and then runs downstairs where accounting is. And I said, what are you paying her? This girl works in accounting. And he says, no, Jamie, that woman is one of the worst sexual assault cases we've ever had. Yesterday, she wouldn't let me touch her or be alone in a room with her. And then we treated her. And then my friend comes down. He's walking different. He looks different. We start walking back to the hotel, me and my friend and his wife. We get about 20 feet from the surgery center. He goes, we just have to stop. And he says, Jamie, if that was the only reason I was ever meant to know you, what just happened to me in there, This may be why I was meant to know you. And then 6 months later, I'm at his house in Hilton Head, North Carolina, and I'm talking to his mother, and she's like, he's a different father. So we're not just talking about what it can do for your current life, even if you don't associate with trauma. This guy, his grandfather was a billionaire, a famous billionaire. The father was spoiled, was a drug addict. So this guy grows up without a father. That father dies young from addiction, but he didn't associate himself with having trauma. Okay. You don't associate yourself with having trauma if you've been needled by someone or you've been bullied, right? Necessarily the way with somebody back from war goes. So what we're trying to do with the Invisible Machine, the book, is bring this to regular people that just don't feel comfortable. But they, for me, I felt so uncomfortable for so long because it started as parental abandonment at birth that I didn't even know what baseline was.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the kind of stuff that he sees every single day. And again, Barack Obama endorsed this thing back in 2008. It's been covered in 60 Minutes, Rogan, whatever, but it's always associated with the extreme. Now with Stella Center, with the Stella protocols, they're opening up clinics. There's 35 clinics in the United States now where you can get it the right way. So that's what we're doing. We're bringing this to the masses. I think this should be more popular than LASIK and Botox.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Botox.
Yeah. Right.
I need to go get some botulism injected into my lip.
Yeah. So that's what they're doing. They're just basically turning off the nerves. And I could explain to you scientifically what's occurring. Basically, when you have a traumatic event and if it's overwhelming or you carry stress too long, what happens with the stellate ganglion, the sympathetic nervous system, these nerves in your neck, is they sprout extra nerves. Okay. And then so it sends a signal to your brain that you're constantly about to be killed. When we turn off the nerves and then we turn back on 10 minutes later with virtually no side effects or no long-term anything, it reduces the amount of nerve fibers. It prunes the nerves back to where they were.
Okay, that makes total sense when I think about when you trim a tree, you trim like a sucker on a tree and then 3 will grow out of it. You traumatize that section of the tree and then more. So if you could go and not do that to a tree, that would be. I
never thought of it like that, but it's a good analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's I'm the analogy king.
Yeah. So I just want to, it's a strange relationship between, a doctor and an artist. When he met that day and he invited me to dinner, he came and picked me up at the hotel. A friend of mine was there supporting me, also going through the procedure. And we went and in the middle of COVID in a rainy Mexican restaurant, we talk about this in the book. He started pouring red wine and gave me a 3-hour lecture on the science of this thing. And then he got in his Tesla and sped away. And I turned to my friend and I said, I think we just had dinner with the smartest human being I've ever met. I believed it. And he sold me with data science.
What a fabulous thing. I'm very, just to tell you what I'm feeling right now, like almost on the verge of tears in the happy way, like blown away. I feel it up here in my throat and my chest in a really, I just feel like I've been, given something like a gift, for a lot of people.
You're describing how we feel when we listen to the blues, it gets in us. And this treatment cures the blues. I don't want to say, you maybe use the word, it resets the blues, it fixes the blues.
That's really funny that you would say that because I was in blues bands for years. I'm a harmonica player, so that's my music.
Oh wow! It doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being on the show, Jamie Mustard and Dr. Eugene Lipov. And the book is The Invisible Machine. I will put a link to that in the description. And thank you so much for being on the show.
And The Invisible Machine, the scientific, the startling truth about trauma and the scientific breakthrough that can transform your life.
Very nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. This is incredible.